Welcome back, another day, another project. We're going to be kicking off a new video series here with the build of a walnut bedside table. Now this is a project that I had in mind for a couple months as we were finishing up our housing projects, and I wanted to see what the room would look like before I designed it all. Before even getting into the build, the design of this was all done in Fusion 360, which is a free CAD tool for makers, and I like to get a good sense of what things will look like before putting too much time and effort into the actual build. This is going to be made of walnut. I have some rough cut walnut that I had gotten from a garage sale a few years ago that I'll be using. And it's designed to have two front drawers as well as some provisions for like USB charging and things. So anyways, we'll get into this video series. I hope you guys enjoy it. As always, consider giving us a thumbs up and drop your comments below. Let's get into this. This is a rare look into the inside workings of Jennings Works. This is my workshop in the basement. It's essentially just an unfinished room that I've commandeered over the past couple of years. And just about any project that goes through the house or gets put on the house starts off here in the workshop. What you see me doing here first is that I've got a lot of this rough stock that I talked about. This is the walnut that I picked up at the garage sale. And this is the case with many rough pieces of timber that you might use, rough pieces of lumber. It's got a little bit of a curl to it. There might be some warps or twists to the board. So my first step in all of these things is that I like to rough cut it to length, essentially about the size that I'll be using for my project, leaving a little bit of wiggle room once things get flat on either end. But it lets me get it down to a manageable size. Usually these are 10 or 12 foot long boards that I'm starting with, and something that's only a foot or so long is a lot easier to deal with. And you don't have to make up for a curl or a warp that accentuates through the full length of the board. What I'm doing here is I'm knocking off some of the high points on the bottom side of the board so that it'll sit flat, so that when I run it through my planer later on, I'm not going to push that curl into the top surface. My planer setup is just the DeWalt 734 series, so it's like a 12-inch wide planer. Not super heavy duty, but to be honest, for all of the projects I've done, it's handled things well. And here I'm doing walnut, I've done oak, I've done ash, so it's a pretty capable machine. Nevertheless, I've got it hooked up with a cyclone dust extractor that I designed and then 3D printed. And so I'm able to capture a lot of these walnut shavings without clogging up my dust filter on my shop vac. I'm running these through with that bottom side down first. That's the edge that I would have, or the face that I would have been running my hand plane on. And that allows me to knock off kind of a flat section on the top side of the board that'll eventually get rolled over, and then I can get things down so that I've actually got two parallel planes on both sides of the board. The material I'm using is 5/4 inch thick, which is pretty typical of what you might find at a lumber yard where it's rough cut. I don't actually want a 5/4 inch thick piece of material to make up my bedside ends, which is what these first couple pieces are that I'm showing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rip these down the width of them and then butterfly them over to do an edge glue so that I can make up almost a panel out of this walnut that's got a nice symmetric look to the wood grain. In order to do this, I'm going to use my table saw. Even though I can't cut all the way through, I can get a good start on either edge. And you'll see in the future few clips here that I use this as a saw guide so that I can use one of my larger crosscut saws to actually cut through this. It's pretty typical, at least in my workshop, where I'm not always using professional tools to get a little bit of smoke coming out of these boards. I've got a 10-inch Craftsman table saw here that my dad gave me years ago, but it might be at times a little underpowered, and I confess I probably use my saw blade for more materials than it's intended. I'm going to nerd out here just for a few seconds. I really like hand saws, and what I'm using here is a Distin & Sons number 12 panel saw. So this is a hand saw that would have been made back in the 1920s, so over 100 years old at this point. I had picked this up at a flea market, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, in pretty rusted condition and with a broken handle, which I repaired and kind of refurbished. I really enjoy this saw, and I cannot stand the hand saws that come at the department stores nowadays. I just think the plywood handles or the plastic handles look terrible. They're not comfortable. This old saw does its job, and it does it well, and I think I like the history that goes along with it. In finishing up the hand sawing, none of these pieces are going to be exactly the same thickness. And so I'm starting with the thickest piece first and running it through my planer, ratcheting it back about a 1/16 of an inch per pass until all 4 pieces are 1/4 inch thick. As these are going to be the finished pieces, I really am looking out for snipe on my planer. So I want them trying to put them in at a slight angle and lift up on the trailing edge to minimize the possibility of that, because I'd hate to really get them down to as narrow as a 1/4 inch and then have some gouge or something that I'd have to go repair or figure out how to accommodate. In doing my glue up of these side panels, I really want to make sure that the edges that contact each other, these inside edges, are very flat, very straight, so that you don't see any type of gap between them. I'm using tape and putting it under tension so that it's really pulling things together prior to actually adding any of the glue. This allows me to fold things open, apply the glue, and fold them closed, pinching it together pretty well before even getting any kind of clamps on it. Not only that, but the tape helps me keep things aligned and properly oriented. With these panels out of the vices and the glue all set up, all I'm doing is using one of my flat blade chisels to scrape off any of the big glue chunks. I'm going to be sanding down these panels with some 120 grit material, but it doesn't hurt to get the big pieces of glue out of the way first. My intent for this is not to have a super glossy finish across the whole piece of furniture. I actually do kind of like the matted or the flat look to furniture. And so I'm only going to be doing 120 grit. I don't think it's necessary to go up to 320 or 400. It'll be lost anyways in kind of the flatness. So with that said, most of these panels, most of the sandpaper you see me using throughout this video series won't be any greater than 120 grit. I'm going to be putting aside those side panels for the time being. They're flat and smooth, but they'll be cut to size at a later point. For the moment, I'm turning my focus back to the table legs. So these are about 27, I think it's 27¼ inches long. And they have a 1.5 inch square profile. Now the material I was using was that 5¼ inch wide or 5¼ inch thick walnut. And once I had planed it down, I was left with somewhere around 3/4 or 7/8, depending on how curved a board might be. And so these are laminated together, and after being laminated, I then took the thickness to the 1.5 inches I wanted. Unfortunately, some of the wood I was using had knots or discoloration in them, as you can kind of see with those two pieces that are leaning up against the wall. And so it's important that when I'm positioning them in the overall furniture that they get placed in a location where they're less visible or invisible once it's all complete. So I've got this actual tabletop. This is going to be a 7/8 thick tabletop. That's down against my workbench there. And I'm positioning the legs on them in the orientation and the position that I want them, and then just marking them with a simple reference designator of A or 1 or whatever, so that I can keep track of the location of them in the assembly. Towards the window, in the direction that I'm facing, those are the legs that are at the back of the furniture. And so those are the legs that have maybe slightly missized or have knots or discoloration. I think it's a really important step to kind of do this dry layout of stuff before you get too far into your build, so that you can make sure that you're keeping your nicest pieces forward and most visible. Now with the 4 legs positioned and rotated in a way that makes sense for my marking, I'm clamping them all together so that they have the same flush ends that would correspond with the tabletop. And that way I can take some measurements, make some marking, to lay out the different features and the different ribs and such that'll be used to hold the whole thing together. Now that I've got the different layout markings put onto the different legs, I've got my router table set up with a 1/4 inch bit that's going to create the mortises in the different legs, so that my different ribs and braces and skirts and things of the table can all get tenoned and placed into this assembly. On my table saw here, I'm cutting the tenons of one of my front skirts on this bedside table. This is the same type of approach I'm using for any of the tenons cut. And in this case, these tenons are more of a rabbet cut than an actual tenon, because I'm only leaving a shoulder on one side of the board. The other side is going to be continuous all the way to the end. Once I cut the face of it like that, I'm going to be standing it on end to cut out that last bit to create a little bit of a tenon on it. Now, based on those mortises in the table legs, I am doing a little bit of dressing up of my tenon cuts. On the back side, I'm going to be taking just a slight bit off with one of my hand planes. I'm going to set it up so that it creates a slight rabbet on that backside rabbet cut. And then I also do need to shorten the overall width of the tenon so that it aligns with what I had in mind for my table legs. Another shout out to hand saws. This is another one of my favorites. It's a small carcass saw that I had found. In the back, it had a blade that was snapped, so I kind of rounded off that back heel portion by the handle. While I'm working here to do a dry fit of the front and rear skirts along with the different legs for the bedside table, I do want to comment a little bit on the tabletop itself. So this was a piece that I put together with 3 different pieces of the rough cut walnut. And just like so many of these other pieces, I first cut each of those 3 just a little bit long to give myself wiggle room. I ran them all through the planer to get everything nice and flat. And then I cut them through the table saw, leaving them a little wide, but cut them through the table saw so that they had a nice straight and flat edge. I then did an edge bond between them to laminate them and put them together. And then with everything dried and secured together, I sanded everything flat, got rid of all the glue, and then put it through the table saw a second time to actually cut the overall width and length of the board. So now I've got a singular piece that makes up my tabletop that was originally 3 separate pieces of walnut. And I'm using this with the bottom facing up so that I can do all my pencil marking on it and get a good feel for where the legs and the hardware is going to go when I install things. Before I get to doing any kind of real glue up of this hardware, I'm going to put some pocket hole screws in the different skirt pieces that I'm going to be producing. And that's so that once I'm ready, I can hold these straight and secure them to the bottom side of that tabletop with some glue to make sure everything's very rigid and strong. All this wood is probably over 10 years old, and it's all been stored indoors and in a dry location. So I'm not very concerned with any kind of warpage or material creep or anything like that. So I'm pretty confident that the screws and glue will be sufficient for this. In other cases where you're doing much larger pieces of wood, thicker pieces of wood, or more fresh pieces of wood, you might run into problems where humidity levels will cause your wood to dry and check or expand and grow, kind of twist, whatever. And in those cases, you might be more interested in doing some kind of slip joint, which would not be a screw. But I don't think that's applicable to my situation here. Now that the process is pretty well understood, I'm going to zip through the layout and placement of these front spars or front ribs that are going to be on the face of the bedside table. I'm just going to do my markups with a marking knife here, and I'm making sure that everything is clamped together so that the two pieces are identical when I go to cut my mortises in them. Because the mortises are perpendicular to the grain and a lot smaller than what I had done with the router previously, I'm just going to be hand cutting these with one of my 1/4 inch chisels here. To prevent some of the tearing that I was noticing, because I'm cutting it kind of perpendicular to the grain, I'm using a wide blade one. It's probably 1 1/8 wide to kind of scribe the overall mortise dimension. And then I come back in with my 1/4 inch to knock out the insides. Similar to what was done with those skirts, these front spars are going to be cut with tenons, but because they're so small, I did use a table saw to cut the shoulder, but I'm using my hand saw to actually shape the overall length and size of them. Like with so many things, but especially with woodworking, it's very important to double check your work before getting too far into the next step. Before doing any kind of glue up, I like to do a lot of different dry fits of the hardware or of the different pieces to make sure things are flush and cut correctly. And so that's what I'm doing here, just checking that the mortises that I've cut work well with the tenons that I have on the ends of these spars. There's nothing worse than getting everything soaked with glue and then finding out something doesn't fit the way that you expected it to. Well guys, I think I've probably eaten up enough of your time for the day. Let me let you get back to it. I'm going to keep working on this in the interim, and I'll catch you on the next video where we start to place pieces together to get a sense for what this thing will look like in real life. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one. Bye.